Hello, good morning and welcome. Voting has begun in the Gorton and Denton by-election in South Manchester. Polling stations will remain open until 10 p.m. tonight. Special coverage begins on Sky at midnight. I'll be in the studio all night long. John Craig is the count in Manchester. Declaration is expected between 3 and 4 in the morning.
And politics at Sam and Anne's will be back too for a special Friday edition tomorrow, looking at the results. We'll give you everything you need to know about that in your feeds at the usual time, just before 8 tomorrow. We hope to have your company, whether you're up like Sam for most of the night or waking up like sane mortals to find out what it all means.
But rules is rules, and that's all we can say about the Gorton and Denton by-election this morning, because the polls are open and we won't be able to say a single word more until the polls close. But fear not, there's plenty more besides today, Thursday, February the 26th. So let's get on with it.
Indeed. So one big thing that will likely be driving the day is the complete figures for legal and illegal migration in 2025 will be published at 9:30.
The Home Office at the moment don't say they're going to do any kind of statement around that. Let's see if that holds. I've got something for you, Anne, on a completely different topic that I want to throw in at the start of this podcast. I heard last night that the government chief whip in the Lords, Roy Kennedy, now he indicated yesterday something big to do with the assisted dying law that is wending its way through Parliament, the private members bill to legalise that. And it's something that will in effect quite possibly kill the bill. He told the parliamentary committee, a Labour body of MPs and peers, that the government would be giving it no more time in the Lords. Now, just a bit of background. This bill, the Kim Leadbeater private members bill, needs to pass before May, the King's Speech, and the end of this parliamentary session. And if it doesn't, it falls and everything needs to start again. It's currently in the Lords, and because it's a private members bill, it can only be dealt with on a Friday under existing rules. There are only 6 Fridays left. We have now seen the government say that it's not going to repeat what it did in December and give this bill more time. And there's so many amendments down, and the rules in the Lords about how you deal with things are completely different, and you can't just guillotine things in the way that you can in the Commons. So the expectation is that this is a moment where the government is in code basically going, we are not going to help this bill through, and therefore it will fall. It's kind of a massive moment.
And this sounds like the outcome advocates for the bill had always feared, that having had a strong start making their case in hopes of getting that end-of-life version of assisted dying into legislation would in the end crumble as it went through the legislative mill. And the question, Sam, to me, it looks like leaving behind is whether this was the case of a lot of unforced errors in terms of not foreseeing more of what the opponents' arguments would be, particularly on the role of the NHS, of the many different angles of protections for vulnerable people, and also the costs attached, all of which just ended up, as you pointed out, more and more amendments and more fronts of opposition were having to be dealt with there, plus the fact that proponents don't have, when it is a private members bill, they don't have that ministerial heft and resource to help them. But they did have personal support for this cause of assisted dying from Keir Starmer himself. So I do find myself asking, could it have been different?
I think that if Keir Starmer, as Prime Minister, wanted to do something, he really could and should have done it in the name of the government rather than trying to do this hands-off process. In the end, we've got this bizarre spectacle, Anne, where one side's principled arguments, and this applies to both sides, right? One side's principled arguments are another attempt to either bully or block. And it's all got really, really nasty. And that's one of the great shames about this. I think the private members route was designed to almost take the politics out of it, but the politics surrounding it have just got worse. This isn't what happened in the 60s with the death penalty. It is a new, different, toxic environment, and it just doesn't work. It hasn't worked in the way I think that in opposition Labour hoped it would. The question now moves on to whether or not the whole idea could be revived after May, in the next session of Parliament, after the King's Speech. Because you did get a majority in the Commons for this when it was voted on at second and third reading. But I am told that the best guess of the sort of government number counters is that actually Labour MPs just don't want to go through all of this again. Sure, they voted for it once, but the debates are so toxic. The confrontations they have with voters are so horrible about this. They would rather, at this moment of much greater political peril than when the votes first took place, this all just sort of slightly faded into the distance. So maybe this all becomes a royal commission. Maybe there's an exploration of whether or not you do it differently. But I think that attempt by the government to be too clever by half, by getting it all done through a private member's bill. Remember, people in opposition in Labour wrote down what they would do, and then in government pretended that it was a spontaneous process. All of that has massively backfired on those who want change.
Something else to note this week, we're just days away from the spring statement, the pared back update on the public finances from the Chancellor. And at 5 yesterday, one of the architects of her first year and a half in the Treasury announced that he was quitting. Matt Pound, the Chancellor's political advisor, who's been very instrumental inside the Treasury machine and trying to meld the politics with the practicalities for Rachel Reeves, is off after the statement. That's another big figure, someone who followed Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves on the path from opposition to government on their way out.
Yeah, no, the sense of people leaving is quite loud at the moment. We don't know where he's going, but it does seem to be on pretty good terms. And there were all sorts of statements given, not least to me and to other journalists, about what a wonderful thing he's been, and how much people enjoyed working with him, and how he was sort of like an effective Labour figure in the Treasury, which it can be quite hard to deal with by other bits of Whitehall. What's interesting is that he is also, as well as just being a senior figure, he is one of the last vestiges of the Morgan McSweeney faction, who are now pretty much entirely out of the door. That McSweeney army that at one point included Paul Ovenden, Matt Faulding, Matt Doyle, Teddy Ryan, Tom Lillywhite, and so on. And maybe even soon Josh Simons, the minister who ran Labour Together, who's under investigation. There is an entire faction now that has been almost excised, and it was the faction that got Keir Starmer the job, is credited with winning the election and gave it a direction. Now there are just big vacancies. I hate to point it out, and they hate me pointing it out in Downing Street, but at the moment, the double chief of staff is only a temporary arrangement, and there's still no director of communication. So there is just that void, and no certainty about the timeline for who is going to replace what. It's a lot of gaps at the top. So it isn't going to be easy dealing with all the complicated things that are going to hit Downing Street in the coming weeks and months.
The way you describe it, Sam, it sounds a bit like that bit in King Lear where he starts with 100 knights and then ends up, what need have you of one? The play goes on, there are fewer and fewer of them. And that so many of these people, as you point out, when you talk about the McSweeney faction there, cut their teeth in the Blair and sometimes in the Gordon Brown machines, but anyway, commanding the centre to the right of centre of Labour. And I think it just leaves that question mark, not just over who is going to do these jobs functionally, which you can feel that lack now in Number 10 and in parts of government and these vacuums that have arisen, but over the whole Starmer project. What will it seem to have stood for when you have all of these people, the Praetorian Guards, who have gone and they'll be off to other things and perhaps supportive, but they will be supportive from a distance, and it seems to lack that cohesion at the centre. The first test of how the government sees its own priorities, at least in spending, will be the spring statement. As we touched on, Rachel Reeves is going to speak for about 30 minutes on Tuesday lunchtime, so it's not a very kind of long play version. And the main task will be running through the latest update from the OBR, is growth up or down compared to the forecast in November, inflation, borrowing, all of those building bricks. And we should see in black and white where some of that spending has gone since the last budget, the additional cash for Send that we discussed on the podcast earlier in the week, and the cost of that U-turn on pubs and on tax on that kind of consumption.
The Treasury are desperate that Tuesday is not, I repeat, not a massive moment, but it nevertheless is a point in the cycle where we get quite a lot of data, and that data is important. So, for instance, we spent 2025 legitimately and rightly discussing ad nauseum the amount of headroom, the amount of leeway Rachel Reeves had before she bumped up against her self-imposed fiscal rules. So we get to see what's happened to that. I think, Anne, actually, they may be able to tell quite a good story because, of course, she more than doubled her headroom to 23 billion. And actually, borrowing costs have gone down a bit since the November budget. Inflation has come down since the November forecasts. So I think I think tonally, and you started to see this with Keir Starmer in the Commons yesterday, they're going to hammer home the green shoot, good economic news narrative. There absolutely won't be policy announcements on Tuesday. There's not going to be an announcement on student loans. I've double checked that this morning. There's not going to be an announcement on defence spending. It is a no policy moment, and deliberately so they can start to make the economic arguments that will then be taken on in March. I understand there's a big speech, which is a kind of update to the Mays lecture. So that this is the beginning of something, but not the moment where lots of things are decided. So I don't think that I think Tuesday will feel a bit more like a victory lap more than anything else. But somebody in government was just issuing this warning. Clearly, 2025 was a year of very grim economic news, and there have been little data points suggesting things are on the up a bit. But one of the features of this government is that it overcorrects itself. And just listening to the PM yesterday, that there's almost a touch of hubris in where he's going with it. You would think that everything was rosy and shiny in the economy. But just to remind you, UK GDP, well, in the last quarter of 2025, it increased by just 0.1%, following a sort of 0.1% increase in the previous quarter. So you might overdo the stuff tonally, only to find that people aren't experiencing the growth that that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are talking about, and that is a bit of a dangerous gap.
Yes, I felt that. There's a whipping up of the benches yesterday to give massive cheers to something which is, it's better to have good news than no good news. But was it really worth all of that? I guess you're Keir Starmer, you just wanted something positive to say. You said along the way you didn't think student loans would be handled in here in the spring statement, but also, as I'm picking up, just tell me if you agree with this or not, Sam, that Jenny Chapman, who was out and about talking about it yesterday, was suggesting a kind of root and branch review, but very much a we will take our time and get it right approach, rather than we're going to come back with a silver bullet. Now we've got Kemi Badenoch, who's obviously really charging out on this issue and how unfair that student loans interest is. So I was just intrigued that you thought it probably wasn't coming very fast, any kind of relief there.
I think that sounds absolutely right. I mean, I think if you're in the Treasury, you're pushing back quite hard on any notion that there would be a U-turn on the decision in the budget last year to freeze the threshold. That's the thing that's triggered this discussion. And I don't think that we are imminently going to see that decision, which was a revenue-raising decision, being unpicked. I think something broader to make the system more fair is on the cards, and that's what Keir Starmer said at PMQs yesterday. He said, we're looking at this and measures around this. So a bit like the way that they dealt with the sort of pubs issue, where there was a tweak, but also stuff around things like licensing laws. I wonder if they take that approach here. But as everybody is aligned, I don't think it's coming super, super fast.
Interesting. And one other kerfuffle to note maybe is the backwash over the Chagos deal. That opposition from Donald Trump doesn't look like quieting down. And how is that then playing out in Whitehall, and indeed in actually just getting this deal over the line, if indeed it is still going to get there? Yesterday, the comment from Hamish Falconer, the Foreign Office Minister in the Commons, in response to a Nigel Farage question, which said, we will bring the bill, back to Parliament at the appropriate time. We are pausing for discussions with our American counterparts. Well, given that the American counterpart who matters, President Trump, had said the UK was making a big mistake and talked about stupidity in handing over that sovereignty of the islands to Mauritius in a lease arrangement for the base at Diego Garcia, it did leave that question about whether pausing was suggesting that this was going to be slowed down and perhaps some concessions or rethinking done. Now, the official line is that Falconer simply misspoke when he said pause. And if you listen to it, he also kind of slightly swallowed his words. So maybe he just slightly lost his own plot in the sentence, which can happen when ministers are speaking. But at the same time, I'm hearing from a US diplomat involved in all of this. He said, look, will the UK not have to revisit this anyway? Because if Donald Trump doesn't support it, what is actually the logic of paying so much, around 35 billion for the base, which in the most extreme, the cases that matter, would likely have to at least be aligned with American policy. It's not something that the UK can simply do itself. The UK's position is it wanted to create a sort of legal certainty so that in any future situation of real risk involving the base, that flights and contractors could operate legally. Can that be maintained if the US isn't behind it? I still see that there's a problem here for the government. I'm sure we'll come back to it.
Oh, God, absolutely. Look, moments after Hamish Faulkner spoke, there was a BBC push alert, and then the world went mad, and pretty much every single journalist in SW1 was messaged by the Foreign Office to say that he had misspoke. So that's a difficult moment for Hamish Faulkner. But I would gently say that the statement that was put out by Foreign Office sources, by Foreign Office spokespeople, and by anybody with a tannoy to hand didn't really quite make sense to me. So we were told there is no pause, although we don't have a date for the reintroduction of the legislation. So, you pick your word. But then they also say, we are continuing discussions with the US and have been clear we will not proceed without their support.
But that's not there.
And as you say, if the American support is not there, if that's not there, and we don't have a date for the return of the legislation, I feel for Hamish Faulkner's thesaurus, because I'm not sure what other words you could legitimately use. I think this just speaks to the sort of absolute sensitivity bordering on paranoia now that there is around the issue of the Chagos Islands. I thought that the Ben Judah piece, Ben Judah is a former David Lammy special advisor who worked on this, who wrote a masterful treatise about it all in the Sunday Times, explaining it far better than I'd ever heard before, basically making the point that the whole Chagos Island deal was done because the legal underpinning of our relationship with the Chagos Islands was under threat, and Britain feared that it would be cut out as America did a deal directly. America, under the Biden administration, did a deal directly with Mauritius, cutting Britain out of the process. And so the Chagos Island deal that Jonathan Powell did, or sort of received from the Tories and got over the line, was all done to make sure that Britain wasn't excised entirely from that corner of the Indian Ocean. And we've sort of lost all of that argument in the way that this government has presented it. It dominated months of Keir Starmer's early period in government, and now here it is crumbling and falling apart at a point where one of the biggest boasts for Keir Starmer is his relationship with Donald Trump, and it is exactly that opposition that is causing all this difficulty. So I can see why there's the paranoia. I can't see how they get through this moment. But what do the Americans do? Do they take direct control of, or do they seek to do a deal directly with Mauritius? Once we get past the idea that the British Chagos Island deal is dead, if we're getting that, what are the Americans' options if they want to safeguard Diego Garcia, which is an incredibly important base for them?
Well, the other question there is, does the UK simply spin it out towards the midterms and hope that Donald Trump's attention wanders elsewhere? So in essence, you're kind of pausing, to be a bit paradoxical, you're pausing on something that isn't really going anywhere anyway. But I just would maybe say, actually, the thesaurus is quite broad, and particularly if you're a former diplomat, and quite talky, which Hamish Faulkner is. You didn't have to use the word pause. It wasn't a psychological tell. That's basically what I suppose I was hearing from parts of Whitehall after that. You could have simply said negotiations are ongoing. I mean, plenty of ways of saying we're talking, but we're not getting anywhere. And if anybody wants to write in and say, yes, we know, because we listen every day, you're welcome. Anyway, I think there are other ways through this, but I think what there are not are ways through it at speed.
I think you make a very good point, not least that we do not talk without getting anywhere. And on that point, I think we should bring down the shutters, because you get 5 lots of us this week, not 4. Can't wait to see you tomorrow at this time for the by-election special of Politics at Sam and Anne. The great news, Anne, is that I will have been up for almost 24 hours at that point. So you and listeners will be able to judge just how coherent I am compared to normal answers, maybe in private rather than on social media, please. Anyway, look forward to seeing you in 24 hours for that, and have a great time.
See you then on the other side of Gorton and Denton.